thank you very much. Perhaps I can give you a reason why I've been invited today. And this really comes down to my daughter, Laura, and my son, Hugo, and obviously my wife, Anne. We had a very ordinary life, a lot of opportunities, and Laura came along, and that's now 46 years ago. And she's a force of nature. She was not what we were expecting, and we were not in a position or prepared to actually be able to deal with Laura. And it all started when she was 6 months old. She had pneumonia. She went into hospital, and 3 days later when we collected her, the pediatrician said, "Oh, by the way, you do realize that your daughter is handicapped." And we looked at her and said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he said, "Well, we don't really know. She might live, she might not. We're not sure. She might walk." And anyway, that was basically our sort of entree into this whole sector. And by the way, good luck was what he said. So anyway, I think actually for us, it was the right thing because we were not prepared to accept that there was no way forward. It totally motivated us. It particularly motivated Anne, who was fantastic. She did all sorts of things with Laura, where she had a feet in cast, she went to music therapy, everything that you could possibly do to motivate her. And a sort of odd thing that happened, Anne one day decided to take her to a healer, and not that we're religious particularly. And the healer looked at Anne when she turned up, and she said, "Oh, what a beautiful soul your daughter has. And what a privilege it is for you that she has chosen you to be her mother." Now, leaving all aside whether you believe these things or not, it was a very, very interesting perspective. Actually, what he was saying was Laura was not some victim, but she was actually an opportunity. And that's what we chose to take. And we've been very fortunate because we've tended to turn the negatives into the good things and to try and be positive. And I think that's the challenge that everybody in this room faces, that we've been given something and through our loved ones, whether that's a challenge and how we actually react to that. And those are the opportunities that we have actually responded to. So it's always been a fight for Laura, which is probably why I'm such a chippy person now when it comes to CQC. Sorry about that, Teresa, but it's been a long time coming, and anyway. So the life sort of went on, and we had to fight for all of her places. And eventually she arrived in Colega Lydia, which is one of the Camp Hill inspired schools, or was then. I think it's now changed quite considerably. And it worked really well for Laura for a lot of years, about 6 years. We wondered how our very sort of slightly delicate daughter was going to handle mud and things down in the Welsh Valley and all of those. But she absolutely took to it. The basket weaving, all of the different things that she did, the reading, living in a small community as part of a bigger community. It was really, really ticked her box, and she grew, incredibly well. But then that started to come to an end, and probably we should have moved her 2 years earlier, where she'd actually outgrown it. And I think that's really important, that all of these services, they should all be looked at from the perspective of how long they work for the individual. And they shouldn't necessarily be for life. I do believe that, because I think we don't necessarily buy a home and live in that home for life. If it's for life and if it's right, that's great. But if not, then we should encourage people to go to what will be better for them. And I know there's a whole issues around what will be better and so on. But I'm thinking now particularly about very complex individuals who we support. And we set up Home from Home Care 21 years ago. And we have ended up now we support about 95 people. We have about 550 staff. And our whole thing is focused around the most complex individuals, the people who are stuck in ATUs. And I really do hold CQC responsible for this. There is no reason why 2,000 people should still be in ATUs, except for one thing, registering the right support. And this decision that they made, where they weren't just going to regulate, they were going to determine what services should look like. And I think that's what everybody in this room is sort of faced with, is that there is this sort of a bigger power that's telling us as families exactly what a service should look like. What they should be saying is, these are the outcomes that you need to achieve in these services. And they should be saying that to providers as well. These are the outcomes that we need. And how they actually achieve that, providing the right metrics are looked at, is something that really needs to be left to providers to a point. And the reason I say that is, that if we keep going down this narrow binary route that CQC are taking everybody down, we will not be able to afford the care which comes out of it. And we won't want the care that comes out of it. It's binary. You did it or you didn't do it. Now, hang on a sec. What about the circumstances? What about the fact that, okay, the oven wasn't as clean as it should have been, but this individual went out for the first time into the community and they hadn't done it before, or they went swimming, or any of those things. And the problem is that the way CQC look at things is not through outcomes. It's only through this binary-based way of looking at stuff. Now, I can say that with full knowledge of the fact they brought out something called the Single Assessment Framework, which was the most ridiculous, crazy thing that they could possibly have done, where they were trying to make everything even more narrow and just saying there is one approach that will suit everybody. We actually had 5 inspections under this. We subsequently have had to take legal action against CQC, and they have actually backed down to the extent that they are looking at one of these inspections where they took an outstanding home, and because it didn't quite fit what they wanted, they decided that it had 4 requires improvements. Well, when we went through the legal process and said, well, hang on a second, this was a rogue inspector who actually made certain decisions based on her understanding of things and not on what the individuals were saying or what their families were saying. And they've actually said they're going to relook at it. But that's the point. We have this regulation which wraps itself up and CQC sit there and say, well, of course, it's all based on evidence-based. Rubbish. It's based on their interpretation of the evidence. We can all interpret this evidence in different ways. And that's why now, and I put it back to 2016, registering the right support, CQC is in a real mess. And as Wes Stream said, they are not fit for purpose. And what comes out of this is they didn't listen. They believed their own story all of the time. They weren't prepared to engage. Registering the right support was classic. We're the ones who went down a legal process. Neil Grant, who's in here in the audience, actually ran that for us in 2016. It wasn't 2017. It was 2016 that they applied it. And only in 2017, because we took them down a legal process, they then went out and reconsulted on it. They were actually just going to push it through. Now, I might sound slightly bitter about this, but I do feel bitter about this because they need to be accountable. The people who are making decisions for us in our society, for our children, there is no accountability for what they've actually done. Nobody will actually say, you know what, we didn't get that right. And that is it. You know, how can you actually change an organization unless you change the fundamental bit behind it of accountability? And I think, you know, closing down all of these villages and having a sort of prejudiced approach towards them is completely wrong. What they should do is, as I think the earlier speaker said, is look at the way that they are actually performing. Don't base them on the number of rooms. It's how do they perform. I rest my case. Thank you.
So I'm Antonia and I'm Robin's very bossy older sister. Robin has Down syndrome. He's now 67 and he's in the grip of Alzheimer's disease. He's lived at Furlong Close near Devizes for 30 years. Furlong Close is a former care village. They were set up by Peter Forbes in the 1960s and were 8 villages. Before he went to Furlong Close, he lived from the age of 18 at Blackerton in Devon at a care village. And that was the first to be set up. And Peter Forbes was a visionary thinker in terms of making provision for people with learning disabilities, in that he wanted to set up a meaningful work and social life balance for adults with learning disabilities. And he wanted a mixture of learning disabilities and physical disabilities to create a community which would meld and blend. Robin still lives with the people he's known all his adult life, because 30 years ago, Care opened the village at Furlong Close in Roud near Devizes, and a number of the people from Blackerton were invited to live there, and Robin was one of them. And it was a fantastic life, really. He worked in a very sheltered sort of way in local cafes and pubs. He had a full social life. He travelled. I mean, he's travelled far further than me. He's been to New York, and I've never been to America. And really, I think probably my family, my mother, were a bit complacent until on October 13th in 2020, HFT, Home Farm Trust, which had taken over Care during the preceding 10 years, suddenly announced in a letter to all the families that Furlong Close was to be closed by the end of June 2021. And the letter opened with this statement. I have to say, surprise is putting it mildly. It was a bombshell and it came out of the blue. No consultation was required by the Care Act. So one of the first decisions taken by the families as we mounted our Save Furlong Close campaign was to challenge the HFT decision at judicial review. A ruling in our favour wouldn't ultimately stop the closure, but it would say to HFT that they had to go away, do the consultation process and think again. It didn't actually get to that because they backed down shortly before the final hearing. And by this time, we'd bought sufficient time, because the whole legal process takes months. We'd bought sufficient time to get our act together, get our ducks in a row, and find, or start to find, a plan that would preserve Furlong Close for our very special people. So the next statement in my letter was, this will likely be a cause for concern. Well, I mean, everyone here will understand just quite what a cause for concern this was. Our special people, sons, daughters, brothers and sisters, were facing eviction from the homes they'd shared with their extended family members in an environment that they knew and in which they felt safe and valued and cared for by dedicated and trusted staff. The majority of the family members were elderly in their 70s and 80s. One mother was over 90, and sadly she died before she knew what would happen to her very loved son. Our concern will be better described as shock, and it was a shock that took its toll both physically and mentally on all of us and on our special people. They, by the way, have been simultaneously treated to an easy-read version of this letter. Most of them can't read. This produced enormous distress and fear, and one chap said, "I thought we were going to be thrown out onto the street." "I wanted to explain the reasoning behind this decision and what this will mean for your relative," said the CEO of HFT. Eviction's what it meant, with 9 months' notice. This, it's turned out, was a generous notice period. The residents at HFT West Sussex, Walberton, another former care village, were given just 3 months' notice. Then came HFT's reasons. As you will know, the site at Furlong Close is a campus site. No, we didn't know that. To our eyes, Furlong Close was, and is, a residential close of 5 bungalows. There's a village hall for use of the Furlong Close residents, and also hired out for events to the local community. There were craft and woodworking shops, a cafe, horticultural, commercial kitchens, providing meaningful training and working opportunities both to the residents and to day service users. The day service has gone completely in Wiltshire now. This one wasn't anything like the hospital sites and assessment and treatment centres, which had attracted so much adverse publicity, in many cases rightly so. Today, we hear that some 2,000 people with severe learning disabilities remain in these facilities because there's nowhere else for them to go. And I do wonder if CQC policy might, in some small part, have a bearing on this. Now came HFT's explanation. As best practice guidelines from our regulator, the Care Quality Commission, have changed and developed over time, it's been acknowledged that campus sites often do not provide best outcomes for people. But research doesn't seem to uphold this reasoning. In our experience, that's the lived experience of all of us, the families of people with severe learning disability, outcomes have largely exceeded expectations, and for people like my brother, born in the 1950s and 60s, these village communities condemned by CQC have enabled people with severe learning disabilities to live long, healthy, active and fulfilled lives. When Robin was born, his life expectancy was 40 years at best. Now, he's a member of what's termed the survivor generation. Those people with learning disabilities who've outlived their parents and are living into old age, which is a whole other issue. So, HFT tells us CQC and Wiltshire Council will no longer be supporting this model of care or register a service like Furlong Close. So there you have it, no more village communities for future generations of people with severe learning disabilities, and eviction for current residents of these communities. Now for the future, they said. Together they, that's Wiltshire Council and CQC, share our that's HFT's, belief that supporting people to live as independently as possible in smaller, community-based settings where people have more independence, choice and control over their lives will provide them with better outcomes. In other words, Robin would be able to pop out for a loaf and a paper. Yes, I recognise that there are people with learning disabilities who, with huge support from paid carers and family members, may benefit from such normalisation. But one size doesn't fit all. And all the Our Life, Our Choice campaign is asking is that they and their families have the choice to live in a village community. My brother's no traffic sense. He freezes when confronted with anything he cannot cope with, like dogs, and he is extremely vulnerable to abuse. He has no functional ability to read or write. He doesn't understand money, other than if it'll buy him a pint. He's never been able to leave Furlong Close without his carer, but within the 7-acre site, there are no gates, no fences. He has the freedom to come and go as he pleases. He can visit friends in neighbouring bungalows, go for a walk around the vegetable garden and orchard, chat to staff in the office. In the good old care days, he was able to walk to work in the kitchen and laundry. It's impossible for me to understand how a smaller, community-based setting would benefit someone like Robin. He would be under virtual house arrest. Many of the Furlong Close residents missed their working lives in the gardens and the workshops. There they learnt new skills, achieved basic qualifications and made friends amongst the day service users. All that's gone. In the good old days, Robin, along with many others, had jobs off-site, in Robin's case generally local cafes, and these jobs gave him huge satisfaction and pleasure that he was part of a very sheltered and very protected part of the working community. As I said, the legal action didn't come before a judge, and during that process we were finding a way of preserving Furlong Close for residents, albeit in a very different form. During the processes of closure, the families had steadfastly refused all attempts by HFT and Wiltshire Adult Social Care to carry out care needs assessments in advance of the move-ons, and that was in order that we should gain time. But eventually we agreed, and in Robin's case, a social worker assigned to carry out the review agreed with all the professionals involved in his care that he was already in the best possible place to meet his needs. But, this is what HFT told us, both HFT and Wiltshire Council are acutely aware of the potential disruption that can come with the closure of the service. The first person I contacted on getting the October 13 letter was Robin's consultant psychiatrist. He advised that moving Robin away from his home and all that was familiar would be a disaster for him. So much for a better outcome. So HFT told us this decision has come only after a consideration of future support options. Oh, good. The future support options which were offered proved to be totally inadequate. Of the couple of placements suggested for a handful of the residents, none was suitable. Some elderly parents, and really I'm talking about people in their 70s, 80s, were asked if they would be able to care for their special people at their own homes. And this is after those people had lived independent lives with care, for many of them, all their adult lives. By the way, I discovered from emails revealed in Freedom of Information requests to Wiltshire Council that the residents of Furlong Close were to be divided into lots for the purpose of rehousing. And I think this cattle auction concept angered me almost more than anything else in this sorry story. We suspected from the outset that there was a significant shortage of suitable care and accommodation options for people with severe learning disabilities in Wiltshire. And yet here was the imminent loss of 39 purpose-built places at Furlong Close. The Furlong Close families were extraordinarily fortunate to find a solution which would enable their special people to remain in their own homes with the staff they knew and trusted. We've had to make compromises, and on the completion of the sale of a site to its new owners, two extraordinarily generous benefactors who put in place a plan which CQC was prepared to accept. All the residents on the completion of the sale by HFT, mind you, they had their arms twisted, did HFT, to sell the site, but that's another story. All the residents became assured short-hold tenants of a specialist housing provider. They receive supported living care and accommodation. Their care is financially assessed and funded by Wiltshire Council, Rent, services, travel, and the rest is paid for through DWP benefits, and if they've got private means, by private means. The Furlong Close workshops, commercial catering, laundry, orchards, horticulture have gone. So too the drama group, the choir, and all the other on-site activities which gave so much pleasure to so many. And it's one of the ludicrous things about the CQC is that nothing can be on-site provided. Even, a group choir. Robin's, he was in the choir actually, if he wants to join a choir, he has to go out into the community and join a normal choir. Well, you haven't heard my brother sing. I mean, he can't, but he likes singing. Okay, you get the point. CQC regulation means that all activity now has to be accessed in the community at large. Furlong Close is no longer a village community in the sense that we understand. But the families did save it for its current residents, and now Furlong Close is able to provide care and accommodation for up to 38 people. Only recently, CQC was encouraged, or persuaded, should I say, to allow another 38 places at Furlong Close. And these are vital places which would have been lost to Wiltshire had Furlong Close closed. There are a number of things I've learnt during this long process, and it's really what drove me to join with the gang of 9 to form the Our Life, Our Choice campaign. I came to the conclusion that the CQC policy could well be at the root of our troubles. This, combined with a funding muddle, which means that supported living is a far more attractive option for cash-strapped local authorities than residential care. I think that the CQC policy developed over the past 10 to 15 years, along with the funding incentive, has discouraged local authorities from commissioning places in residential care. And no business, charity or otherwise, can sustain that sort of a loss. So residential care villages became unviable and are forced to close. In the Furlong Close situation, funding was never put forward as a reason for closure, but we know from Freedom of Information requests that funding had been under discussion for months before the decision to close was taken. I think there are a number of major issues in relation to people with severe learning disabilities that need to be addressed, and these are for the future. The CQC policy condemnation of congregate settings, the funding muddle. I think that the money should follow the individual, that the person should have the care needs assessments and be allocated central funding along with their entitled DWP benefits, and should then, cash in hand, be able to choose from a full range of care and accommodation options, including village communities. And the final thing is stability and security. Once settled and safe, a person should not be moved unless they wish to be moved, or their families feel it would be in their better interests to be moved, or their physical and mental health needs make that unavoidable. And on that note, please take a look at the change.org petition, Save Stephen, Stop His Eviction from Old Orchard Care Home due to funding cuts. I think you will be horrified. Thank you.
So my focus today is going to be on what I'm going to call campus settings, but not with the CQC definition. I'm going to define it myself quite specifically for people with profound physical as well as learning disabilities. People like my son James, who is autistic, epileptic, doubly incontinent, uses a wheelchair, has pica and also challenging behaviour. People for whom therapy is an essential part of their daily lives, but who don't need a nursing home. A report published by the Council for Disabled Children in 2017 showed a 50% increase in the number of children in this group in the previous decade. And these children are, of course, now becoming adults. Nobody is defined by a set of labels, as I'm sure everyone in this room would agree with, but they can serve a purpose, and it will be helpful to refer to them today. So what do I mean by a campus setting? I'm referring to what is provided by most residential special schools and colleges for this group of people. A site with a number of care homes in a cluster, with a cafe or a place to meet. However, there is also a swimming or hydrotherapy pool, or both. And crucially, a team of directly employed therapists who supervise and train the care staff. There are very few campus settings in England for profoundly physically disabled adults with learning disabilities once they leave education, and the CQC will not permit the expansion of existing ones or the building of new ones. Those few that do currently exist have waiting lists that are years long, and those waiting lists are national. The residents in adult campus settings are drawn from across the UK. I'll expand on campuses in a minute, but first I want to introduce you to James, because his experience will help to illustrate why these settings are important. James is 25. He's clever, energetic, self-aware, and has a great sense of humour. But he can't speak or walk. And if there is an unexpected change in his routine, he will become anxious and he might hit himself or others. From the ages of 8 to 22, he lived on site full-time at residential special schools and then a college. His needs were so complex that very few places in the whole of England could meet them, and he ended up living in Devon, then the East Midlands, and then Cheshire for 14 years in total, despite our home being in Birmingham. He couldn't cope with transitioning back to our house for visits, so we spent large amounts of time with him in his environment. He has 2 siblings, and this split took a heavy toll on family life. The specialist input he had during his years at school meant that he became able to take steps using a walker and communicate using a talker. Behavioural techniques allowed him and his carers to reduce his fear of change, leading to fewer outbursts. When he finally finished college, he didn't have the mental capacity to choose where he lived, so we had to choose for him, in conjunction with his integrated care board. We badly wanted him to have his own house near to us, but then worried about who would be working in there with him when we were no longer here. The spectre of abuse is ever present in parents' minds and can appear anywhere. We realised that in any event, for his own quality of life, he needed a campus setting still. That would also ensure, as our commissioning lead said, that there would always be eyes everywhere. After months of trawling through what were then around 30,000 registered care homes, I could only find 10 campus settings that might be suitable for James. We were very lucky to get him into one, and he now lives at the Hollybank Trust in Yorkshire. As there are parents here, I will mention that Hollybank may have a vacancy, and the CEO is in the audience if you want to speak to her later. So why did I spend 2 years of my life trying to get James into another campus setting as an adult, meaning he would continue to live over 100 miles from his family? There are 5 reasons. A large team of trained staff can work across the site. Employed therapists can give ongoing support to the residents and the staff. On-site facilities make those facilities easier for residents to access. A sympathetic community familiar with profound disabilities is on their doorstep. And there is overarching management of all services and continuity for when families are no longer here. Staff dealing with people like James have to be trained in therapy, behavioural techniques, and the management of seizures and medication. They also need to be familiar to the residents and know their routines. Once, a new agency worker forgot to give James a 5-minute countdown that it would soon be time for tea. He took James's iPad away, James's favourite thing in the world, without warning, and ended up being hurt. It isn't uncommon for people with profound and complex disabilities to need 2-to-1 care during the day as well as waking night cover. There are 3 shifts in many care homes every 24 hours, so some residents may need 6 people looking after them every day, 365 days a year. That's a lot of trained staff. In a campus setting, carers can be moved around between houses where necessary to cover sickness, leave and turnover. There will usually be someone available who knows a resident and is not just referring to their care plan. Hollybank Trust has its own employed physio, speech and occupational therapists. It also has assistive technologists and a behaviours coordinator. These professionals are the most important ingredient of a campus setting for people with physical and other complex disabilities. If James was not at Hollybank, he would face a postcode lottery of local NHS and council services. Those services are not provided on an ongoing or proactive basis. Instead, if they are available at all, the team will step in to address a problem and then close their case and step out. Profoundly physically disabled people need constant proactive monitoring of their posture, movement and equipment, which can't be done by ordinary care home staff. When equipment needs to be repaired or replaced, the physiotherapists liaise with commissioning authorities who can't argue with their professional assessment of what is needed. A care home manager would have a much more difficult time getting the thousands of pounds that this equipment often costs. The therapy teams are also able to train the care staff. The talker with the electronic voice that James spent years learning to use would be gathering dust if there weren't a speech therapist to program it and to show the staff how to help James to use it. The assistive technologists have ensured that James has Alexa linked to his iPad and he can control both the lights and the TV in his room. Since the professionals are all employed on site, they can have multidisciplinary team meetings. Once, James had to move bedrooms for 2 days whilst his room was being repainted. The behaviours coordinator prepared a social story with the speech therapist for the care staff to read to James in advance. That way he knew what to expect and was less likely to hurt himself or others because of the change of bedroom. Multidisciplinary meetings would be highly improbable with local services. James finds transitioning from one place to another stressful, as do many people with autism. Sometimes he even refuses to leave the house, never mind being loaded into a bus to go somewhere else. People who are very physically vulnerable, who, for example, can't move their limbs or are tube-fed, may also fear leaving site, even if they're not autistic. Having a wheelchair-friendly route around their home to just step out for a walk means they're more likely to leave the house. Going to the cafe gives a focus to the day. Having an on-site pool means they're more likely to get in the water than by scheduling a trip to a leisure centre in town. The physiotherapists use the pool to give on-site sessions, for example, stretching spastic limbs, which may otherwise become permanently stiff. For people using wheelchairs, the water is often the only place they can truly move independently and provides a vital physical and mental health benefit. The importance of living in a community of people where you feel comfortable and accepted is particularly important to those who fear going out. James loves Christmas but would struggle to cope with a carol service at church or a hall. At Hollybank, they hold one outside around a giant Christmas tree with Makaton signing of the words. And living on site doesn't mean that residents have to be automatically institutionalised. There's a garden centre and a pub across the road from Hollybank where the residents are welcomed and given tables with lots of space. There are also models of campus settings where the public come onto the site rather than the other way around. So, for example, National Star have a bistro staffed by students where the public can eat. It's even rated on TripAdvisor. And fifthly, my husband and I are now in our 60s and have to ensure as much as is possible that James will be looked after when we are no longer here. There must be many people here today who understand the immense challenge and terror of what the future holds for families like ours. Unfortunately, carers come and go, as do care agencies. All care providers live in an uncertain world where funding is under constant threat. But by choosing a not-for-profit specialist organisation with a campus setting, we've done our best to ensure that James has wraparound care for life. Many adults in the UK with severe physical learning disabilities, autism and other complex needs want to live on campus settings, but there are only a handful of them. The CQC policy against allowing care providers to expand existing campus settings or develop new ones is denying these residents not only a choice, but also access to the therapy and other services they need. In my view, this is disability discrimination and is not acceptable.
Thank you, Baroness Cass. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ron, Antonia, for being here. And there's something that came out of the talk saying that the CQC says no other people we talk to, no providers, commissioners have asked for these changes. You just have to look at this room to see how wrong that is and how much room there is for expansion in this thing. This has been a very big learning curve for me because this is where the rubber hits the road. We've seen the PowerPoints, we've seen the clauses, we've seen the human rights, we've seen the United Nations. And it reminds me very much of when I was a foreign correspondent, being in a particular village in Africa where there was malaria, there was malnutrition, there was a civil war was impacting it, cattle were getting stolen and all that sort of stuff. And I was sending messages to the UN and that about this village. And I said, what are your priorities? And it came back saying, our priorities for such and such a village is gender equality and democracy facilitation. And I said to them, to the people, I said, what do you want? They said they wanted a stockade to stop people stealing the cattle. They wanted a bridge put over a creek so they could get to a hospital, and they wanted running water and all the rest of it. But that doesn't actually feature in any human rights legislation in the United Nations or anything. It's all those clauses that we saw in the law and in the CQC reports. Now, I'm here today because I'm a civilian. I try not to get involved in this stuff at all, but my son has just turned 29. He had a complicated early birth, and he came through with physical learning and behavioral challenges, what's called complex special needs, that we've heard a lot about. And despite all that, he loves the piano. His musical skills and compositions and sheer imagination have left his piano teachers in awe. He's currently cutting an album with a special needs charity in Peterborough, where he's been for the past few months. Having said that, it took him 5 years to find somewhere in Britain to live, and nowhere in Britain exists that lives to match any of those clauses we've seen in the CQC or in the UN or anything like that. I'm having to micromanage his care for at least an hour every day. And there are small little things that I was talking to someone about at lunch, that a buckle on his shoe is broken and therefore he doesn't walk. If he doesn't walk, and none of the care staff think that they should get it fixed so that he can walk, then he either has behavioral episodes or constipation. And because they don't check him necessarily properly at night, he could get constipation and he could die. And I've been told on many occasions, but you're a parent, you see it differently to us. I said, yeah, I would love to see it in a different way if one little thing wouldn't necessarily lead to his death because the apparatus is not in to safeguard that. We looked for 10 years for a place, and the place it's got at the moment, we're working with them very closely. And I think it'll take another 2 to 3 years to make it right. But this country, the system, the culture, and we've seen about the culture in the CQC and others, I don't particularly put on the CQC, the local councils, we've seen all of us what happened over the post office and Grenfell and all of that, and I think you're hitting the same culture here. I've been trying for a month to get a statement out of the CQC about this conference, asking them specific questions on campus and congregate, and I got basically a copy and paste of the guidelines. Nothing. Heads in the sand. It's not, this one choice fits all, this choice thing. If my son was asked, would you like to go sailing today? Would you like to play the piano? Would you like to go out and see the family? He would say no. He doesn't have the capacity to choose. And if he says no, and if the care staff adhere to the UN guidelines, he would sit in front of a television all day and eventually die. That's the situation that I think all of us here live in. And before I go, I just want to throw out a job advertisement, because I'm sort of moving from youth to adulthood and not going to be around forever. If any of you out there think you can or know anybody who can move in as a parent and advocate to look after my son, or not look after, just to oversee the management of that, to make sure his walking frame gets fixed, to make sure his nails are cut and all that, David can get hold of me. He knows that. There is a salary, there will be national insurance, there will be a pension attached to it, whatever. But this is what I need, and I think many of you might need too. And that also doesn't exist. So as a final thing there, we've heard a lot about this now. My son, and I think all of you here, our human rights are not respected. The system is constructed as such that they are not respected. So I think this organization, which I bumped into over congregate and campus settings, could expand enormously to make sure that the rights of every special needs person is respected and that they are not discriminated against. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was so powerful. And the point is really well made that this population of young people and young adults is going to grow. The numbers of people who have life-limiting conditions is expanding as medical technology increases. And so it's not just that we're fighting for everyone's brothers, sisters, daughters, sons in the room, but also for the generations coming up behind who are also going to face all of the same problems. And certainly when I was chair of Together for Short Lives, which is a children's palliative care charity, an increasing percentage of the young people that we were looking after were people who were going to survive into adulthood, who were going to have those complex physical and broader support needs. And we're actually looking at transition from people who are using children's hospices as respite that isn't available in adult hospices. So this is a much broader issue. And I think although those numbers might be alarming, they're also important for us in terms of getting strength for the campaign that we're all engaged in. Open to questions.
Hi, I'm Alex. So many of the things you said, Jane, would apply to my daughter. You know, I saw that campus living really suits her. So, as Sophie Santi said earlier, you know, why if it's okay in the college environment, isn't it okay later? You know, her college is just teaching her skills for life. She can't, it's not A-levels or anything like that. But it really suits her that. And I'm trying to develop a new West London housing community. But from what you've said, because I'm new to all this, that I'm not even going to get past the first base because they're going to just turn around and say to me, oh, you want 30 people there, oh, that's no good. But the reason I want 30 people there is all the reasons you said, so that there could be therapies on site and a cafe and facilities and a community. So is that actually the situation now, that I won't get anywhere with that?
I'll make 2 points. Firstly, on why it happens in college and not after college is because this artificial focus on education. Because they may need to continue to have a physio and everything and a walking frame after they've left school. They're no longer in education, so they don't need those things anymore. So that's an artificial divide. In terms of whether you can do that, there's probably people better equipped and learned than me on the particular regulations and laws about it. The one distinction I do know is that it's easier to get permission for something like that if it's supported living rather than care homes. It all becomes different. It becomes different. There is hopefully in the audience a lady from an organisation called Cream Care who's had specific experience of this. I don't know if Beverly's here. At the back. You might have a chat with Beverly because they've had to look at that model for their residents who have similar presentation from what you say to your daughter. But I couldn't say further than that because that whole area of regulation is really my area of expertise.
I mean, it just seems from everything you've been saying that the CQC would just turn around and say, oh no, that we don't like that.
Well, that's my understanding, which is why I'm up here.
Yeah. So where do we go from there? What do we do about it?
Well, I think that's the discussion that we need to certainly have over the panel and think about where we're going strategically as we move on through the afternoon. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Steve Godwin. I've got a daughter who lives in a community in North Yorkshire. It strikes me there's a systemic problem here that's beyond individual models of support, care. It's really how we treat people in a humanitarian way and actually honour the post-war humanitarian movement. The whole panoply of oversight and scrutiny of what's happening is really important.
It's a really good point, and certainly that must be part of our approach. I'm going to take the last question there and then...
Okay, I'm a parent of a 32-year-old young man with complex needs who lost his care home because it became an outmoded model of care. When I contacted the CQC directly and asked them, they actually said they were told that people don't do well in bigger accommodation. Which begs the question, because my son doesn't communicate, how do we get to a point where the powers that be really ignore a huge group of people like us, who have got individuals that are non-verbal, who challenge services? When our son's care home closed, we looked at 33 alternative providers. They didn't want him. He was too much, too difficult, too complex. Yet I had people saying to us, if he moved into supported living, he could choose his own colour of his door or his own utility supplier. Now, how did we get here? How did we get where people are paid professionals can make decisions like that over my son? And do you know where he is now? He's with two 70-year-olds, mum and dad. We stood him because we didn't want him in an ATU. And that, I'm sorry, Teresa Joyce, I really respect you for coming here today, but that's on the CQC. And now we're going to hold on to him at home, protect him. Nobody's going to make bags of money out of him because we're doing all the admin. We're going to protect him until something better happens, because he's not going anywhere until that happens.
So I just wanted to tell everybody that I've just got a statement in from the CQC, but it says that the CQC is looking at some of the language in our guidance to add clarity for providers and commissioners that we assess and rate services of. And that is in specific answer to my question about looking at congregate and campus settings. That came in just a couple of minutes ago.
Wow. You haven't lost the skill of the news break. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.